Firstly, I'd like to apologise that the main author of the report couldn't be here today, Billy Cheng. ADM Capital Foundation supports very much the work that Responsible Research is doing because we're funded by 3 founders of a hedge fund. So we think that the work that they're doing to get environmental, social, governance issues out to the investment community is fantastic. So the report. Essentially for the report, we've included these countries. However, because of the nature of the listed companies in the benchmarking and the importance of those companies in terms of the trade of forest products, and because of the natural resources in terms of forest resources those countries have, the report necessarily emphasizes on China, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So the first issue that we'd like to discuss, or we think is actually probably one of the foremost challenges for investors in this sector, is actually the lack of reliable and consistent data. I think Paul mentioned earlier that data is really important to find out what your base resources are. Well, in terms of data resources for forest resources, you'll find that actually it's pretty hard to get reliable data. These resources, it's important to get this data because you want to be able to estimate global and regional trends. You want to know the extent and status of the forest, extent of deforestation, carbon stores, forest dwellers. It's very difficult to get that information. In this report, we've used the UN FAO data, which is generally the most widely recognized data available. They're doing a forest resource assessment currently at the moment every 5 years. There's going to be they're releasing their next assessment in October, I believe, which is 2005 to 2010. They released country summaries, country reports earlier in the year, and that's what we've used. However, it's also worth recognizing that the FAO data depends on country submissions. As a result of that, the collation of data as a result of the reliance on country submissions, there are inevitable problems with inconsistency and also with completeness. The data also depends on country averages. So it's not spatially explicit, so it's very difficult to find exact what's going on in an exact situation. So as a consequence, FAO data can differ significantly from other data that industry experts and academics provide. However, there is no real alternative in the industry at the moment. Just an example of a key indicator of deforestation, FAO tend to provide forest change from year to year, so they include plantations in that. So they don't actually necessarily provide deforestation data. So you want to go to the country for what's the deforestation data for a country. So if we look at Indonesia, the government statistics are around about 1 million hectares per year currently. But if you speak to the industry insiders who are on the ground, have been there for 10, 15 years, they say it's more like 1.6 million hectares per year. So you've immediately got an issue on your data sources. This is compounded by lack of transparency in the sector, which you're probably not surprised about, and lack of disclosure by companies on their ESG risks, as well as chronic government corruption within the sector. There also appears to be underreporting on a number of issues, social conflicts, for example. It seems to be that there's possibly a lot more of that going on that actually ever gets to the press, and what does get to the press is really the really bad cases. There's reports of intimidation also stopping people reporting. On the flip side, there is an enormous amount of NGO activity on forest-related issues, which can be good, can be bad. But what it does do is it provides additional information. The problem then is determining the veracity of that information. Moving then to another issue, is you may or may not realize this, but the region has actually experienced an increase in forest cover over the last few years. Now that's principally a result of plantation development that's largely coming from China. Despite that, the forest resources in the region are still under considerable strain, the natural forest resources. Indonesia and Malaysia have had significant deforestation over the last few decades. According to the FAO, Indonesia now has about 94 million hectares of forest land. In 1990, it had 119 million, so quite significant in just the last 20 years. But there's also been an dramatic increase in plantation area, 21 million hectares over the last 5 years. Again, that's principally due to China. Other countries also have significant plantation targets that they would like to reach. This is industrial plantations. A lot of that is going into pulpwood. One of the issues to note, though, is that a significant proportion of the plantations isn't actually going into industrial hardwood, it's actually going for environmental protection. So although China has got significant plantation, quite a bit of that is actually going for environmental protection purposes. Then there's also the issue of productivity and actual planting area. The Indonesian government has given figures of about 4 million areas of industrial plantations, but then there's also the experts who are saying that potentially only half of those are actually planted, and then there's also 3/4 of that is for for pulpwood. So there's also some questions there over the numbers. And I think the concern there is that if the pulpwood, if the increase in industrial plantations is driving pulpwood capacity because the governments want to fill the capacity, if that pulpwood doesn't come through, you have increased capacity, so where does the wood come from? So that's a concern. I think no presentation on sorry, it's not moving. No presentation, I think, in this region will be complete without a look at China. Now, China is fundamentally important to the forestry sector. It's a world leader in industrial roundwood, wood-based panel production, furniture exports, and paper manufacturing. It has a significant appetite for timber forestry products. In 2008, it imported 44% of its tropical timber requirements and 21% of all its timber requirements. And there's an increasing trend there. Now, this demand is possibly, or most likely, fueling some of the illegal trade. And this trade in itself is estimated to be between $10 to $15 billion per year. While other countries in the region, such as Indonesia, are undeniably sources of illegal wood, China is arguably the protagonist, distributing it worldwide. And then potentially exacerbating that situation, some of the suppliers supplying China are also are also threatened in terms of their supplies of wood. Perhaps an interesting point to highlight here is certification. Globally, certification of managed forests is around about, I think, about 8%. Asia is significantly lagging now and has a very small fraction of that. Now, the problem I think there is here is that China is not really demanding certified wood, yet that is where the demand is coming from. So what is the incentives to companies to go for certification? And we've come across several companies in the DIY industry who want certified wood in the region, but actually can't source it because it's not available. So you're going to have to have a really tough finger to get this one going. Oh, there we go. And then moving on to carbon. It's pretty much recognised now that reducing carbon emissions from addressing deforestation and forest degradation is potentially a cost-effective means of addressing climate change. So that's red. If you consider that Indonesia is now the world's largest global greenhouse gas emitter, you can see why the rainforest nations all think this is of material interest to them. And there's intense pressure by the international community to develop a global strategy that will monetize forest carbon and make these forest assets worth more standing than they are cleared. Now, the Asia region's been responding very positively to this, as you might expect. Some would say it's almost furthest ahead than most other regions in terms of national RED strategy development, institutional capacity building, demonstration projects, RED regulations, although we know there's a lot of toing and froing, sometimes within government on those. And there have been setbacks. Project funding is expensive, which is not surprising when there's no guaranteed future cash flow. There's no international framework. We have only a voluntary market currently, and the price of carbon has fallen and is relatively low. And social issues are going to be a key issue in RED. While doing this research, we had a quick look at the Forestry Carbon Portal, and they only list 2 carbon projects that are actually operational in terms of technically have the contracts for trading carbon. And one of those, I'm pretty sure, isn't actually trading carbon. Nevertheless, there are many of these projects being developed in the region. We know that the voluntary carbon standard has recently approved the first RED methodology to go through VCS. We've recently learned of a second one that should be going through in a few weeks. So things are on the move, but at the moment it's feeling pretty stagnant. And until I think the international negotiations actually move in a certain direction, I think it's going to be quite a difficult area. Very briefly, we've talked a lot about social conflict, so I won't go into too much detail. Suffice to say, about 350 million people depend on forests, tens of millions of indigenous people. They live in poverty very often, marginalised, We've also heard about the reasons for the problems of social conflict. In terms of the extent of the problem, one research that we came across in 2006 estimated in Indonesia maybe 2 million people were affected, but if you actually count within 3 kilometres of the forest boundary, that's as much as 20 million people potentially affected. And we've heard about the reasons for that. Now this, I think, is a particularly challenging issue for investors in terms of their due diligence, and this is largely as a result of the nature of these disputed lands being so remote and so distant, and also the apparent legitimacy sometimes of the government licenses that are provided. It seems that in certain circumstances, particularly in Indonesia, that the issue of rights to forestry companies is provided even before the status of the land has actually been determined. And then finally, my time's up, quick word, can't forget about biodiversity and the nature and the value of forests, and they are an incredibly valuable resource. Just looking at water, protection of watersheds, about 4.6 billion people worldwide depend on forest systems for their water sources. And then if you think about that forest systems are associated with 57% of total water runoff, you can see the very big importance that these resources do have in terms of droughts and floods. So in summary, these ecosystems are of fundamental importance globally as well as locally, and they're innately linked to human well-being. Thank you.